Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I have a topic I want to dive into, and that is pre-workout nutrition and the framework I use with clients and how we go about setting this up. But first, before I dive into that, over my free body recomp checklist. So this is 10 things you need for a body recomp. I also dive into why it's important to focus on body composition, what is body, the two types of body recomp as well too, and the common phases that you'll go through. So definitely go and check that out. It's totally free and it will give you really good information on things that you need to focus on to improve your body composition. With that out of the way, and again, that's completely free, and the link to that is in the show notes there. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic around pre-workout nutrition. So I think for most people, you don't need to micromanage your pre-workout nutrition. And a big part of it's going to be personal preference, but we also want to look at goals, type of training you're doing, et cetera, on there. But I don't think we need to micromanage this and have this absolute perfect meal around pre-workout. But there's definitely some things we can do that could hurt performance, and there's some things that we can do to help improve performance, essentially. Really, when it comes down to it, for most of the training that you're going to be doing, unless you're some sort of high-level athlete, I think we have some wiggle room here. But obviously, I'm going to dive into that today. So let's talk. So we're going to go over from a lifting and a cardio standpoint. And understand there's a lot of other different types of training. So again, if you're some sort of athlete for something, this may change things slightly. I can also talk to you actually about how I do my workout nutrition or my nutrition around hockey as well too. That could be interesting. I'm going to put this in my notes. So a lot of times with these podcasts, I'll have a general idea what I want to talk about, but sometimes I don't really like to have an overly done outline. I like to just go on tangents sometimes if I see fit there. And so sometimes I have ideas that pop up when I'm doing this. And then sometimes I have ideas that pop up afterwards and then I'm pissed that I didn't go over it. But that's just a little insight there with that. Cool. So I'm going to go over what that looks like because I could add in a third type of training here because I'm going to go over lifting. I'm going to go over cardio. And then again, if you are playing some sort of sport, I guess that could be super helpful as well too. I'm actually upset I didn't do that in my post, but I may actually go back and do something around that there. All right. So let's talk lifting. So again, when we talk lifting here, most of the lifting that I'm going to be doing with clients is going to be hypertrophy based with a little bit of strength added into it. Maybe some clients will do a little bit of power based, like plyometric type stuff as well too within this, right? So that's what I'm going to kind of group into this there. And again, this type of training, we obviously want our performance to be in a really good spot because that's what's really going to drive muscle growth and what's going to drive body composition change. But in saying that, I don't think depending on the time of day you train, it's not mandatory to eat beforehand. I know a lot of people will say, oh, it's a really bad idea to go and fast it. You're going to absolutely just crush performance. You're not going to build muscle. You need to make sure you need to go in and eat. You need to go in and eat. I have a lot of clients that like to work out first thing in the morning, and it's just not feasible for them to get in food. And sometimes by getting in food, we end up now they're adding extra calories into their day. Now they're going into their workouts just a little bit heavier, like heavier in the sense that there's food in their stomach. So there's some things that we can do to improve that. But at the end of the day, like it can be counterproductive. And now then on top of it, now they're trying to slam some food in, and now they're eating when they're stressed, and that's going to mess with digestion as well too. This can be very context dependent there. So if you're lifting first thing in the morning, I don't think it's mandatory. And if it's a shorter session, say less than 60, 90 minutes, I think it's even less of a priority there if you're training first thing in the morning. At the very least, though, we want to make sure we're hydrated there, right? So that's honestly the thing that I feel like people need to focus on more when they train first thing in the morning is just making sure you're hydrated. Now, you don't need to go and slam a gallon of water, but we do want to make sure we get some water in, maybe even some electrolytes before you work out. I know a lot of people talk to people in the fitness industry. It's a split of, oh, you absolutely have to have them. And then on the flip side, electrolytes are a complete waste. I don't think it hurts to take them, especially if you sweat a lot, you eat a relatively clean diet, probably a good idea to take it. But if you're someone who's 50 pounds overweight, you don't really sweat, you eat a lot of processed type foods, okay, yeah, you probably don't need to take sodium or anything like that. But I still think it might not be a bad idea to take some, maybe a lower sodium type electrolyte or something like that there. But electrolytes are really interesting. I feel like people either love them or hate them, which most things with fitness. But to me, that's the main thing is we want to make sure we're hydrated. Now, one thing that sodium could help with is like a pump and like blood flow and things like that. We could get a better pump there as well too if we have some sodium ahead of time. But I think at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're hydrated going in. That's going to lead to worse performance off the bat. Even like 2% dehydration, which is not a lot, or even 1% can impact performance there. So we want to make sure we're at least hydrated there, right? So that's if you're training first thing in the morning. I really don't think you need to necessarily focus on having a meal. And again, I'm going to go over some caveats to this. So this isn't done after this part. I'm going to come back to this. I have some overall thoughts, and then I want to share a few studies too to tie everything together. However, if you're training later in the day, more than 2 to 3 hours after waking, I want you to eat something within 1 to 3 hours beforehand. Okay. What I don't want to happen though is if you have a really extended fast before your workout, that I don't think is a great idea. I think if you eat at say 6 to 8 p.m., go to sleep, wake up at 5 a.m., go and work out by 5:30 or 6, I think you're totally fine. Just make sure you're hydrated. But if you eat at 6 to 8 p.m. and then now you wake up at 6 and you don't go and train till 10 a.m., I think you need to eat something before you go and work out. I think now you're going to run into the issue of you're probably going to see some detriment from a performance standpoint, which in turn is going to lead to less muscle growth over time. So again, if you're training longer than 2 to 3 hours after waking, we need to make sure we eat something within 1 to 3 hours beforehand. Biggest thing being here is we just want to avoid high fat, heavy meals or high fiber meals too close to training. So if you have these kind of heavy meals, high fat meals, high fiber meals, you're just going to find that you may feel worse because you're going to have just that type of food's going to go through your GI system a little bit slower than some other type of foods would. So my biggest priority is one, we want to stay hydrated. We probably don't want to go overly hungry going into your workout, as being hungry tends to show in the research that you may have worse performance there. Yeah, from other studies, they found that hunger itself might influence performance there. So again, just the act of being hungry could negatively impact your performance there. So that's kind of my main thing is I don't think we need overly stress this perfect amount of macros, this perfect meal. I think biggest thing being if you're training fasted first thing in the morning or training first thing in the morning, could you have something that's really light potentially, right? And we'll go over that here towards the end. But if you're ravenously hungry, you may want to look at potentially adding in something ahead of time. Again, if we're going more than 2 to 3 hours after waking, I would like you to get some type of food in. But the biggest thing being you just don't want to be overly hungry going into that. Cardio, to me, it's totally fine to be fasted if training first thing in the morning. Again, from a cardio standpoint, there could even be some potential benefits of doing cardio from like a fuel utilization, metabolic flexibility standpoint of, and you might have some unique adaptations from doing your cardio-based training fasted. I wouldn't make it a thing of you need to go out of your way to do that. Now, don't get this confused. This doesn't mean this is going to lead to more fat loss because that still is a calories in, calories out thing. But there could be some benefits of training fasted from a cardio standpoint there, right? However, if it's a longer session, 60 to 90 plus minutes, I still would probably consider some carbs and protein beforehand there, the longer these sessions are. But again, if you're doing something that's less than that, you're probably fine to train fasted. And if anything, you may have some unique benefits from that perspective, especially if you're always like, if you never do any sort of fasting or, and when I say that time, like time restricted eating, where you're constantly eating all the time or eating around the clock, or you're always trained in a fed state, could be something that potentially could be beneficial for you there. However, with that too, like always want to take into consideration where the person is at. If someone's under a high amount of stress load, they're super lean, they just have a high stress load on the body. Again, that may be something that isn't the greatest thing for them at that moment in time. So it is still context dependent, but I think generally speaking, that is something that, could potentially have some unique benefits to it. Whereas like from a lifting standpoint, you're not going to get necessarily any benefits. It's more of a practicality thing with that. But again, same rules as lifting. Like I want you to be hydrated. We probably want to avoid high fat, high fiber, heavy meals too close to training. And again, if you're training later in the day, more than 2 to 3 hours after waking, then I still want you to eat 1 to 3 hours before. So really everything's the same other than you might get some unique benefits of doing fasted cardio, not from a fat loss standpoint there. But so those are the main things and the main difference there with that. All right. So again, just some additional thoughts on pre-workout nutrition. So actually, let me talk about hockey there. So any sort of sporting event. So hockey is going to be a pretty energy demanding, right? I think it's going to depend on like the level of play, how hard you go, your skill level, things like that. But it is all relative in general, right? And also like your cardiovascular fitness, obviously the worse cardiovascular fitness you're in, it's every little bit's going to be more stressful on the body. The better cardiovascularly fit you are, you could probably push harder, and then there's going to be less of a stress on the body because of that. But generally speaking, hockey's going to be these kind of sustained bouts of, at least the hockey I play. If you play ice hockey and you play at a professional level, you're probably looking at these shifts are going to be 30 to 60 seconds. If somebody is out on the ice for longer than a minute, it's like that's a long shift in there, and you can tell that they're feeling there. Whereas I play roller hockey, I play in a men's league. My shifts are probably 2 to 5 minutes. So they're a bit longer. So it's a little bit different than what hockey would typically be there. Again, you need a good aerobic base for both, but again, you might need that top end. Like you need to be able to really push it for a short amount of time. And like ice hockey, whereas with what I do, I need to be able to I don't necessarily, you want to reach top, but you're not going to be doing that the whole time. It's probably going to be a little less from the top end intensity with the type of hockey I play there. But anyways, this is something that I feel like no matter what, I would want to get some sort of food in beforehand. If I'm playing hockey at 8 a.m. in the morning for whatever reason, I probably want to get in something beforehand. I probably don't want to do that fasted just because I'm going to tire out quickly. I'm going to feel terrible. So with that, I do try and get food in within 1 to 3 hours for sure, pretty much at all times. I don't think there's going to be any benefit to doing it fasted. And for me, again, same thing here. This is going to be something that's going to be like a higher carb, moderate to high protein type meal. And ideally, I'm limiting the fats in this meal as well, too. Things that I'll do are like Kodiak cakes, bagels, smoothies with fruit in it, things like that. Like those are the types of foods that I would have, like rice cakes, then obviously like Greek yogurt or protein shakes, or those usually are the main ones that I'm typically going to have there before hockey. So that to me is something that probably needs we do want to have some nutrition going in, and then obviously staying hydrated with that. All right, so some additional thoughts. So again, if you're training more than a few hours after waking, we do want to get some food in beforehand, right? Like I don't want you to fast for half your day and then try and go and get a workout in. The only time I would train fasted would be if you have to do it first thing in the morning. So for sessions under 60 minutes, pre-workout nutrition really doesn't need to be a big focus. Like it doesn't have to be this perfect meal. We just need to go with preference here. And again, I'll go over that here in a little bit, but we just want to go with preference and practicality. Again, if your sessions is less than 60 minutes and it's like a weight training session, like I said, we don't need to stress having a certain meal or certain macros or anything like that. And again, we could go in fasted, especially if it's first thing in the morning on there. But if our sessions end up being longer than 60 minutes or like higher volume, like high intensity, pre-workout nutrition may start to matter a bit more. We need to start to pay attention to these things a little bit more. Again, what you do over the day and week is more important than one perfect pre-workout meal, especially if you're only training one time per day. So that's the big thing here. And most people listening to this are probably training one time per day. So again, what you're doing throughout the week is going to be more important and throughout the day. And so what I mean is your energy availability leading up to that and throughout the week. So this is why I say training fast in the morning, if it's a practical thing, probably isn't the worst thing in the world, because if you're eating in a surplus or maintenance the entire week, you're going to have plenty of fuel ready to go. Now, if you're eating in a deficit, you may have less. And so we need to potentially look at this. But again, now if we add in food before our workout and we're in a deficit, then we have to take away food throughout the day elsewhere, right? So they're always going to have that. And that's always something that we need to look into at that point. And then obviously what you do throughout the day. So if the day prior you ate at maintenance and you feel you had enough protein, you had enough carbohydrates, again, it's like you didn't do anything to where that is not there. That's still going to be there at that point. And this is where I come back to. It does seem like hunger can potentially play a role in performance, right? And not necessarily like how many calories you're having or anything like that. So we could use a strategy to where you just need something that will curb hunger a little bit and you should be good to go on there with that versus, okay, you need to get 35 grams of carbs in this perfect kind of macro split or perfect type of food there with that. But again, I think we overlook what we're doing throughout the day and throughout the week on there, especially for training once a day. If you've always trained fasted, say you've always trained first thing in the morning, or you've waited an hour and trained fasted because you thought there was some sort of benefit or something like that, and this is more so on the weight training side of things, try a small meal before training and see if it improves performance or recovery. It may or may not. So it's definitely something you could try. Again, some people feel better training on an emptier stomach. Others feel worse when they're overly hungry. I know I personally do not like to be overly hungry. So I'm always going to try and I want to make sure that I'm not hungry going into my training session. So I'm going to set up my nutrition to make sure that happens. Some people, they're okay. And so let's say you train in the middle of the day, you have your breakfast. You don't need to make sure you get in a meal 30 minutes beforehand. That at that point, especially if you like training on an empty stomach, that meal that you had at breakfast, you're probably good to go at that standpoint for that workout. But again, if it's now over 60 to 90 minutes, high intensity, high volume type training, then you may need to potentially look at eating a little bit closer to your workout at that standpoint. So I do think there is some preference to this. As I said, I personally do not like to be hungry, so I'll always make sure I'm eating within a couple hours of my workout sessions. Again, knowing all this now and knowing the research around this, if for whatever reason I need to train first thing in the morning, I will do it. And I'm not going to overly worry about not getting in food. I'm not going to try and force feed food early in the day to get something in before I work out. Protein itself won't directly improve performance, but eating it 1 to 3 hours pre-workout gives more flexibility for post-workout timing. And it probably helps with, you're not going to dig yourself into as deep of a recovery hole as well too if you eat some protein within 1 to 3 hours before. But protein's not going to be something that like you eat beforehand and you should expect this like performance increase. Now, again, if we go back to the concept of you being overly hungry can impact performance. Protein can help with satiety. It could help from that standpoint, but physiologically, there's not going to be anything that's going to improve performance with protein, whereas carbohydrates, that's going to be something that obviously can improve performance in certain situations there. And as I said, you don't need to find the perfect macro meal before training. We just need to find what works best for you there. And again, I personally don't like feeling overly hungry in workout, so I go with a lighter meal that has protein and carbs, doesn't feel heavy, and is timed 1 to 3 hours before lifting. Really, the big thing though is don't underestimate the power of being hydrated going into your workouts. I can't stress that enough. I think that's going to impact your performance more than anything else there. So just to go over some research around this. So there was a study from King et al. In 2025. They had 16 trained participants. They were on a high carb, low carb, or near 0 calorie placebo, consumed 2 hours before training. They did 3 sets each of back squat, bench press, row, and shoulder press, and there was no difference in total reps across conditions. Hunger ratings were also similar there. So really, so that one there just shows that okay, when we're doing these weight training sessions of 3 sets, 80%, probably not overly important to get carbs in beforehand on there. All the things that we talked about matter more. However, there is some research that shows fasting before resistance training can reduce performance, but this is particularly for lower body lifts. However, placebo-controlled studies often find no difference versus eating carbs. So again, probably comes back to the hunger side of things as well too, right? The biggest thing being just making sure you're not overly hungry going into it. Carbs before, during training tend to improve volume performance and like higher volume or lower body focus sessions on there. So again, carbs in meals beforehand are going to help more with like high volume, lower body focus sessions, or if you want to maximize lower body strength gains there. That's how, and I guess one last thing I want to add to this too is I think goals are a big factor. So if you're someone who's trying to absolutely maximize strength or like muscle growth, that might be different than someone who, yes, they want those things to be in a good spot, but they're not overly concerned about like building the most amount of muscle as possible. And again, I think that often gets overlooked. So with pre-workout nutrition, I do think it's important. However, I think we can overthink it and over-focus on it. And a lot of times it really comes down to preference, and what you do throughout the day and week is really the most important. And I can't believe, okay, so that would be more for post-workout there, which I did another separate post on that, which I'll probably have a podcast out on that in the next couple of weeks in terms of what to do post-workout on there. So that's pre-workout nutrition. I hope this is helpful. I hope you gives you more insight into what to focus on in your meals around training. Let me know if you have any questions on this topic. If you found this podcast be helpful anyway, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find it. And then lastly, if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active on social media, and I'll talk to you guys soon.